Hello and welcome to this COP27 Business Debrief, a Planet Mark webinar presented in partnership with the Institute of Directors. We're delighted, and it's indeed encouraging to have so many of you on the call today, and we look forward to great interaction throughout. Please do use the chat, and if you wish, type away, let us know where you're dialing in from today. It would be great to know where we have got you all in the UK, beyond the UK. Type in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. We will post a few questions during the webinar today in the chat for you, and there will also be an opportunity to use the Q&A function for you throughout. So that you know, we're recording this session and we'll share it with you along with a one-page summary, summarizing everything that you're about to hear. So we'd also love it if you wanted to connect with us on socials, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. We're on there, Planet Mark's on there. You'll find us using these handles and hashtags, do more good. And yeah, so let's have a look at what we've got lined up for you during this hour. My name is Amelie, Head of Engagement at Planet Mark. I'm joined by my colleague Andrew Griffiths. Some of you will have followed his brilliant daily reports from Sharm el-Sheikh. We've also got the pleasure of having Dr. Roger Parker with us, Director of Policy and Governance at the IOD. So we'll start off hearing from Andrew and Roger. We'll get their summaries and insights from COP27, what the implications are in their views on the business community and what business leaders basically need to do next. There will be time towards the end for a Q&A session, so please use the Q&A function for that. So that's it for in terms of housekeeping and overview. It's my pleasure to be handing over to Andrew for an overview of what COP27 is all about. Andrew.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. It's amazing seeing everyone tuning in the chat. We've got people from South Africa, Yorkshire, Edinburgh, Cambridge, Carlisle, Essex, you name it. But so yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from. And we're, get engaged in the chat. We are watching it. So if you have questions as we go, you can try dropping them into the chat. But the best place to put questions to us will be the dedicated Q&A tool that you'll see on the buttons for. And you can actually vote for your favorite question. So if you see someone asks a question that you want us to answer, give it a thumbs up, because then that will filter and we can answer the questions that the majority of you want to hear the answers to, really. So very briefly, just in case people have been, I don't know, living under a rock and weren't sure what COP27 was, we thought we'd summarize what even is COP. And so COP stands for Conference of the Parties, because the United Nations is really good at catchy acronyms. And the first ever COP was held in 1995. And they in principle, they happen every year. And so some of the key milestones within that you may have heard of are things like the Kyoto Protocol was the 1997 COP3. Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 was COP21. And so the one this year was COP27. COP26 was in Glasgow last year, and COP28 is being hosted in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates next November. So why does COP27 matter? Like, why does a big United Nations summit matter to businesses? What's the relevance? And the real key thing is the regulatory waterfall that comes down from these things. And so what happens is international regulations and standards get determined at these kinds of summits, or certainly are sort of geared around. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative was launched off the back of the Paris Climate Agreement to have science-aligned net zero targets. And so that then cascades down into national targets and standards. So each country within the UN sets a nationally determined contribution, i.e. how much carbon emissions are we going to reduce by over what period of time. That then inevitably cascades down into national regulation, policies and standards. And then the reason that sustainability legislation and regulation is quite different. There are lots of different types of international legislation. So things like modern slavery is something that's been passed down. But what's different about sustainability is scope 3 emissions. And that's because so much of a larger corporate's carbon footprint sits in their supply chain. So unlike things like modern slavery, which sort of cascade down and get to the large corporate level and then mostly stop, i.e. small and medium-sized businesses don't take on the level of reporting and measurement and action requirements that larger organizations do. With scope 3 and with net zero, they have to pass that onto their supply chain because such a large proportion of the corporate carbon footprint comes from their suppliers. They need their suppliers to be on the journey too, which is what makes sustainability legislation quite unique. Now, that's sort of a broad brush summary of the regulatory waterfall. This is more what it actually looks like. I'm not going to go into detail here. I just wanted to emphasize how much of a sort of an integrated network of regulation standards sort of cascades down. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of the key, more recent policies and regulations that have come out from this COP summit and just before that you're going to want to have on your horizon because of how they're going to cascade through the supply chain and come to meet you. Sabila, I've seen sort of the questionnaire slides. We're producing sort of a 1-2 pager that will be circulated after today's session. And that will come around and have all the key insights that we've talked about today on it in a nice, concise format. So that's my summary of what COP27 is and why it matters. And I'm now delighted to hand over to Dr. Roger Barker from the Institute Directors to share a bit about the IOD policy team's view on what happened at COP and what the significance is for directors and for businesses around the world. Over to you, Roger.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. And I suppose, I don't know how closely everyone here today has been following things, but overall, my assessment of COP27 is that it was a relatively disappointing and slightly chaotic COP. Now, certainly the agreement to launch a new fund to help pay for climate-related damage in vulnerable countries, that seems to have been a breakthrough and is welcome. Although as yet, we've no idea where the funding for that fund will come from. However, the bigger picture, I think, is that global emissions continue to march on. They've now exceeded their pre-pandemic levels. They're continuing to increase. And COP27 really didn't offer that much to stem that increase. Specifically, I'm thinking that there was no agreement to phase out the use of fossil fuels, or to ensure that emissions were going to peak in a year like 2025, which much scientific opinion has suggested that that's the year when emissions need to peak if we're going to limit overall temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. In fact, there was at the COP some talk of the 1.5 degree warming goal being omitted entirely from the final text. And in the event that didn't happen, but the fact that that was being discussed was probably not a positive sign. I think from a business perspective, if I'm being entirely realistic, the way the trajectory is pointing at the moment, it seems pretty unlikely that we are going to stick to the goal of 1.5 degree or a 2 degree temperature increase over pre-industrial levels. Probably, if we're realistic, we're heading for at least 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I think the whole task trying to actually make an impact on emissions has certainly been made more difficult by what's been happening over the last 12 months. The war in Ukraine, the greater concerns around energy security are making it more difficult for many countries to address the achievement of net zero. And I have the feeling from COP27 that the fossil producing countries felt somewhat empowered by this situation. And this was reflected, I think, in the rather last-minute negotiation process, the rather chaotic negotiation process that we actually observed at the COP. I mean, on an even broader scale, though, I think that most of us would agree that the technologies are out there to substantially reduce global emissions. But at the moment, we just don't have the right price signals in place in the form of something like a carbon tax. And we don't have this consensus between the public sector and private sector in major countries to share the risk, to invest in the sort of technologies that we actually need to really make a difference. That's the sort of kind of my negative take, I suppose, on COP27. Let me now turn to some positive developments, which I think really occurred more around the margins of the conference rather than in terms of its sort of end text or big announcements. But there were, in the midst of it all, I think there were some useful steps forward for business. For example, I'm really heartened to see that the International Sustainability Standards Board is really now fully operational. It was established a year ago by the IFRS Foundation at COP26. And it seems really now to be motoring full steam ahead. Its purpose is to create a global baseline for sustainability accounting and disclosure standards. And according to the ISSB, we can expect to see the first of these standards being published early next year. I think that will be a real step forward for business. It appears also that the ISSB has been engaging with the other parts of the disclosure ecosystem, which already exists, and which will help its standards to become embedded and accepted faster. And there was an interesting announcement from the Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP as it's now known, which has come together with the ISSB to actually accept ISSB standards in its future surveying and questionnaires that it will send and share with companies when it's assessing their carbon disclosures. There are around 13,000 companies that submit their environmental data to CDP on a voluntary basis. And the fact that CDP and the International Sustainability Standards Board are working together, that I think is a very positive sign. Another positive thing that I observed at COP27 was the announcement made by the UK Transition Plan Task Force. Now, this is a body which is chaired by Andrew Griffith MP, who used to be the czar of the Net Zero Task Force in the UK, who's now Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and Amanda Blanc, who is the CEO of Aviva. Now, Task Force is trying to establish a consistent framework through which companies can present their net zero transition plans. And the Task Force has published proposals that they're hoping to move forward with. They're running a consultation on it. And the aim is to finalize this framework by next summer. And I think that's coming not a moment too soon, because according to CDP, of the 13,000 companies that submit climate data to them, only 30% publish a transition plan, and only 1% publish a disclosure that is sufficient for investors to actually assess if their transition to net zero is feasible. So it is very important that we start to have a framework for transition plans for companies around the globe. A final important development that I think is worth pointing out came from an international body called the Climate Data Steering Committee. And this is a body that was founded by Emmanuel Macron and Michael Bloomberg earlier this year. You may remember it. And it's planning now to create a new publicly accessible data platform, which will allow much more open access to organizations' climate data. And I think this is an important step forward, because up until now, this kind of data has really only been available through commercial or proprietary services. So having some kind of open database will do a great deal, I think, to contribute to transparency surrounding business and climate change. Other positive policy developments, some of which are not directly related with COP27, which I just want to mention. There is no doubt that the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a major step forward for that country. This is the most significant climate change legislation in US history. Even if it is a bit protectionist in places, it is committing the US to make huge investments in renewable energy, providing huge tax incentives for solar energy, investment in electric vehicles and home energy efficiency. So the impact of that could be quite substantial in what is the world's second largest emitter. So I think that's something that should give us pause for optimism. And I'm just glad that the US managed to get it through Congress ahead of the midterms, because as we know now, the control of the House of Representatives has changed from the Democrats to the Republicans. And if they'd been trying to get, President Biden had been trying to get that through now, he probably wouldn't have managed it. I should also mention another big plan which came out of the EU earlier this year, called Repower EU, which is partly about making Europe independent from Russian fossil fuels, but it's also a big plan to accelerate the EU's drive towards renewable energy. So some good things are around at the current time. In summary, was COP27 a major step forward in terms of addressing climate change? Probably the answer is no, and that will be disappointing to many people. However, what I do think is happening is that we're starting to see some of the essential plumbing being created within the business system, which is going to be needed if we're going to seriously decarbonize the economy and create the needed transparency and accountability. So it's still a work in progress, but I do have a feeling there's a lot of business goodwill out there, and we need to keep pushing forward. To you, Andrew.
Thank you, Roger. Really interesting and sort of a really sort of strong overview there. Just a reminder to people, if you've got questions based on the thing that Roger shared there, put them into the Q&A tool rather than the chat, because the chat's going to be quite a busy place and we'll lose track of them. So if you've got questions, put them into the Q&A tool and vote on your favorite ones so that we can answer the questions that everyone actually wants us to hear, because we've currently got around 200 people on this webinar. So there's a lot of different voices and people for us to try and sort of meet the needs of. So I'm going to start sharing screen again, because I'm going to talk a little bit now. Now, obviously, I actually went to Sharm el-Sheikh for the first week of COP. And so I thought I'd share a little bit about what did it feel like on the ground, you know, for people who weren't able to go and to travel there. And so there's some little photos here. Sharm el-Sheikh itself is described by the locals as Egyptian Las Vegas. and it kind of earns that name. It feels very resorty. It's sort of on its own in the middle of the desert, surrounded by mountains. So it's sort of a bit of a natural fortress. And it's a really, you know, basically it's a tourist destination with casinos and lots of different things. So you can see in the bottom left there, sort of that was the view from sort of the roof of where I was staying. And so it was very much sort of in like a retail mall kind of area. And there are a number of different venues. You have the blue zone, the green zone, the innovation zone, and then lots of fringe events like the extreme COP hangout that you see on the bottom right there, which is this wonderful Bedouin tent on a cliff top overlooking the ocean. But in terms of what was the feeling for people who were there, the first thing that jumps out is that it was organizationally and logistically a little bit of a shambles. The blue zone, which is where all of the actual negotiations happen, ran out of food and at one point water fairly early on in week one. And a lot of the sort of blue zone and green zone was still being built during the first few days of the COP summit. So logistically speaking, there were a lot of issues where volunteers didn't really know where stuff was, and so it took people a long time to find venues the first time around, and so it took a while for everyone to settle in, you know, into the space. I also wanted to sort of share a little bit about the green zone, because the green zone, I'll be honest, it wound me up a little bit because the green zone was huge, and they had this lovely sort of open air space where they had all these sort of like greenery and different things. But these photos were taken on day 2. And as you can start to see probably from some of those images, A, there's still construction going on. If you look in the top right, there's sort of barrels and bits and pieces lying around. And B, all of the plants were already dying because they weren't meant to be there. It's a desert-like conditions. And the way that they tried to create this sort of lush Garden of Eden just didn't really work for me, to be honest. And they made sort of huge sculptures out of waste. That was very nice, but if you were to choose a number of words to associate with the climate crisis, I probably wouldn't have gone for breathe, play, relax, implement, sure, but like a lot of the others, sort of it missed a trick. And so there was quite a lot of frustration for people around the green zone, in particular because all of the actual meat and bones, i.e. sort of the what we had to go and see in terms of the exhibits and all of the different people who had stands, you had to walk about 10 minutes probably through all of this open art area in order to get to that space. And so the green zone wasn't necessarily that busy a lot of the time. And there were some similar issues with the blue zone as well, where sort of they didn't necessarily always have the numbers of people, the amount of foot traffic that they were hoping for. So that gives you a bit of a view. The logistical challenges became the British replacement of talking about the weather, because the weather was consistent. There was nothing to talk about. So instead we talked about, how long did it take you to find the innovation zone? and that was our way of bonding as we connected with people there on the ground. But the outcomes of COP. So many of you have seen sort of my LinkedIn post, but we were looking for 3 major outcomes from COP from Planet Mark's perspective. The first was the raising of national ambitions and stronger wording in the final text. And as Roger already alluded to, this one's on a bit of a red light for us. It basically copied and pasted the Glasgow COP26 agreement, and the delegates had to fight tooth and nail to even manage to keep the 1.5 degrees in there and keep the existing ambition in there. There was a lot of a push to try and roll some of this stuff back. We also failed to progress on the fossil fuels thing. It was actually India led the charge, but the EU were behind it as well, to change some of the wording from phasing down unabated coal to phase down all fossil fuels. Now, that would have been a really significant shift and a much needed one, but that failed. It was in the draft text, and it got removed. And incidentally, worth noting that the oil and gas lobbyist representation increased 25% from COP26. They were the second best represented body from any of the countries or sectors. There were 656 delegates from the oil and gas sector. So maybe had something to do with it. And there's a lot of questions around how people should, how businesses and how sectors should be engaging in the COP process, and to what extent they should be given access to negotiators and all of those sorts of things, somewhat as a result. There's been very limited increase in the nationally determined contributions, which is the critical thing where all of the nations up their goals. COP26 told all of the nations they had to submit improved targets by this year, but in actual fact, only 24 countries submitted improved targets. So we're currently still on track for between 2.4 to 2.8 degrees of warming, and that is assuming everyone hits their targets. So not really good enough, frankly. But on the plus side, there were a few firsts. So we saw the first ever mentions of food security. First time food has ever been mentioned in the cover text. First time nature-based solutions have been referenced, and the first time tipping points have been referenced in the text. These were all things that they tried to get into the COP26 cover text, and they got removed at a late stage. So there's some progress, but overall red light for us. And just to keep things a little bit light, this is kind of the equivalent of what's happened. Staying the same is not good enough fundamentally. By not raising our ambitions, raising our targets, moving into action, we're sitting still on a treadmill, and that means we're moving further away from where we need to get to. This is the, the simple equivalent of exactly where we are in terms of our ambition when it comes to climate action at an international level. So there you go. There's a nice little funny metaphor for you to bring it to life a little bit. The second thing we were looking for was climate finance and a loss and damage funding mechanism. So this was one of the big sticking points of COP. And, hindsight being 2020, it was quite clear that this was going to be the one thing that if they didn't resolve, they weren't going to come to an agreement, because developing nations really put their foot down on this issue. So there was genuinely impressive progress on loss and damage. And so this loss and damage is essentially the acknowledgement that the nations who are being most impacted by climate change are typically the ones who are least responsible for climate change happening. A lot of island nations, developing nations. And so loss and damage is meant to acknowledge that and provide financial support to countries who are facing climate-related damages, to support them to repair, to adapt, and to become more resilient to climate change. The reason this got onto the agenda was largely thanks to the G77, different to the G7 and the G20, the G77, which this year was chaired by Pakistan. Now, obviously, Pakistan saw more than $30 billion of damage done to their infrastructure, and thousands of people died, and hundreds of millions displaced when a third of the country was submerged underwater. So that is an example of a country suffering from the consequences of climate change. And Pakistan is certainly not one of the countries who bears the most responsibility for it happening. And those floods were found to be made 80 times more likely as a result of climate change. So there's a clear, correlation there that we need to address. Currently, the reason that this is on an orange and not a green is that currently there's very limited actual sort of clarity on who's going to pay into it, how much they need to pay, who's going to receive the funding, and how will those funds be distributed. These details they're meant to be sort of agreed in the build up to COP28. They're forming a task force who will establish this. But this is where there's a lot of contention, because a lot of the developed nations want to make sure that nations like China and India, who are still categorized as developing nations, but are also large economies with large emissions, are incorporated in needing to provide to the loss and damage fund. And they also want to limit the number of countries that can sort of qualify for the loss and damage funding, which is why this wording came in around countries who are particularly affected by climate change rather than all developing countries, as the case may be. There's still skepticism around how, much this is going to, countries are still very skeptical about it, because we still are failing to honor a commitment we made in 2009 to reach $100 billion per year of climate finance for mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. So there's definitely a real need for us to back ourselves and demonstrate that we've taken this seriously and we are really moving forwards. So far, there have been some loss and damage funds announced from a number of countries, including Germany have pledged 170 million euros, Austria 50 million, Ireland 10 million US dollars. Scotland Scotland were the first ones to offer a loss and damage fund at COP26 last year, which was 5 million. They've now increased this to 7 million pounds. So that's good. And it's nice to see they're sort of being framed as loss and damage donations at the moment, which is interesting. But it's good it's happening. But when you compare it to Pakistan, 30 billion US dollars of damage from the floods that they've seen this year, you start to see the gap between where we are now and where we all need to get to really support these countries with adapting to the effects of climate change. Now, final one was the wider business announcements outside of COP. And this one very much is on a greenish, I'll call it. It's greenish. One of the exciting ones for the UK, at least, but also because I do think it's going to be a format that will now be picked up and taken to other countries as well, is the UK Transition Plan Task Force Framework. So at COP26 last year, Rishi Sunak announced that all listed companies in the UK and financial institutions will have to submit their net zero plan to the FCA by the end of 2023, by the end of next year. Over the last year, they've developed the framework for what that needs to look like. What does a good net zero plan look like? So that's now been established. It's well worth going and having a look at. It sets out a framework. I'll dive into a little bit more detail on this in a second, but we won't be able to go through everything because there's a lot. The second thing is the ISO net zero guidelines. So this is the first end-to-end framework that we've really had for net zero governance, because things like the Science Based Targets Initiative gave us really good guidance around what a good target looks like. UK Transition Plan Task Force gives us really good guidance on what a good plan looks like. But the ISO net zero guidelines is like an umbrella framework that will provide the foundation for all other standards moving forwards. They've been working closely with the ISSB, working closely with the UK Transition Plan Task Force and others, and the UN Race to Zero team, et cetera, to create this foundation that gives us what does a good target look like, what does a good plan look like, and what do you need to have in place to make a net zero claim. Final one I'll mention is that the US has followed in the UK's footsteps by announcing that they're going to make it so that all public procurement, all government spending, the major suppliers will have to submit net zero plans and submit carbon footprinting, reporting data and progress on an annual basis to government. Now, that's really promising because we've seen it in the UK and we've seen the ripple effect that that has and how that's coming down through supply chains in the UK. And we're going to see the same thing happen in the US now, who have something ridiculous like a $3 trillion budget per year. So the way that that's going to ripple through industry is going to be quite pronounced, which I'll mention a bit more in a moment. Now, I mentioned the ISO net zero guidelines. I wanted to give a little bit more clarity on this. So this is the reason that this is so significant is because of the fact that it has achieved consensus. That's why this is going to come into effect and have a really powerful impact. More than 1,200 organizations and people from more than 100 countries contributed to the process. It was developed over a period of about 3 or 4 months. And as I mentioned, it's that first end-to-end net zero governance framework for best targets, etc. But it also includes some quite wide-reaching governance implications for directors that you absolutely need to be aware of. I'll give a few examples here, but we're likely to organize more of a deep dive on the ISO net zero guidelines, so I can't go through everything, but watch this space and we'll have a dedicated session on this. So the first is that you must incorporate net zero targets into core governance documentation. So your articles of association, charters, legislation within the organization. So really embedding net zero targets in at the core of the mandate for the business. Second is around appointing competent members of the organization's leadership to take responsibility for actions. You need to bring people in at a board level who have accountability and critically, and there is a definition to this, who are deemed competent. So they need to be someone who has some training and knows what they're talking about when it comes to net zero and when it comes to sustainability at a board level. So that's a sort of really critical piece. Third, organizations should disclose shareholder voting records on climate-related issues. That will have a substantial ripple effect to basically share who's voted for what and what the vote stated and what guidance was given to the board from shareholders on these issues. The fact that progress and the measurements need to be monitored and verified by a competent third party. So the need to get a third party verification, accreditation for something like Planet Mark or another to reinforce and say, yeah, not only are we saying that this is the progress we've made on net zero, we've had it checked by a competent third party. And then finally, you've got to tie director remuneration and leadership remuneration, the compensation and bonuses, to meeting the interim and long-term targets. And the suggestion that they give, the EG, is 20% of the long-term compensation plans for directors. So these sorts of things really cascade in, and you see how they start to form this umbrella of making sure that good governance on net zero is embedded within the organization. So hopefully that makes sense. Planet Mark, we've been really delighted to be part of this process. We had team in every single one of the 3-hour virtual workshops. There were 36 hours of workshops in total, and 3 rounds of written feedback that developed this. And we're working very closely with the BSI and the ISO teams to basically fully align our net zero program at Planet Mark with the guidelines to demonstrate how these best practice guidelines can be put into action. And so, we've been delighted to be involved throughout the process, helping develop them. And we're really excited now to be able to demonstrate, okay, now we've got these best practices. What does that actually look like in practice within our net zero program, which is really exciting. The UK Transition Plan Task Force, I'm not going to go into detail here either. We'll have a dedicated session on this one later. But as you can see here, it's quite robust, is what I wanted to emphasize with these graphics. You can go and look it up. You can download all these resources for free. But basically, it builds on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the ISSB's proposed standards. So it's slightly ahead of the curve, i.e. they've been liaising with them ahead of the ISSB releasing their standards, which are anticipated to become the sort of top tier of standards that everyone else will align with in early 2023, as Roger mentioned. And this is the framework that UK listed companies have to submit by. It flags 4 key elements to a good plan. You need to have high-level ambitions to mitigate and manage changing climate. So you've got to set your net zero target, essentially. You need to have a plan on short and medium and long-term actions. You need to have accountability mechanisms in place for governing what you're doing and sort of the governance of that process. And you need to measure and address risks and opportunities within it. So that's the high level overarching thing, but you can see that there's then a more robust framework that goes through, step by step, everything that you need to have as part of a plan in order for it to be seen as credible to the FCA. Just a quick note, the reason this is so significant is that if you are anywhere within the supply chain of a UK listed company or financial institution in the UK, within the next 12 months, they are almost certainly coming to ask for your carbon footprint, okay? Because you will be a substantial proportion, along with their other suppliers, of their carbon footprint, and they will need to get you on board the net zero journey as well. And to give you an example of what this might look like, this is a real example. September 2021, more than a year ago, Tesco sent this email to every single one of their suppliers, and they had 4 asks within this email. They said, we want you to give us your carbon footprint by the end of the year. That was 3.5 months notice. So that's, imagine your biggest customer asking you for your carbon footprint in 3 months' time if you haven't currently got it together. We need you to set a net zero target by the end of 2022. It needs to be a science-based target with a 50% reduction plan for 2030 by the end of 2023, by the end of next year. And we need you to switch to a renewable energy provider now if you haven't done so already. This is the sort of thing, this is how it cascades. So I'm hoping we're making this sort of make sense to you. The international stuff, so these nebulous, weird agreements that get made at COP cascade down through, they get applied at the national level, then they land on large organizations, and then the large organizations, because of Scope 3 emissions, pass on this requirement to their suppliers. This is why it doesn't matter how big your business is, you need to care about this. Because, okay, you might not directly supply a listed company, but do you supply someone who supplies someone? Or who, there's a Russian nesting doll of, of supply chain accountability here. You might not even know that you're in their supply chain. And within 12 months, they're likely to come for this data. So it's really important that you get ahead of the curve and get yourself ready for this, because you're either on the risk side of the coin or you're on the opportunity side of the coin. The risk is that you get this email from one of your biggest customers, probably someone who's a bit of a halo brand for you, where you say, oh yes, we're a supplier of Tesco. And then you face potentially losing out on that business if you aren't able to meet these kinds of requests. But on the flip side, the opportunity is if you can meet the requests, you may be able to get more business from these sorts of organizations because they're looking for people who have proactively made a difference and started developing a track record on reducing their emissions and achieving net zero. Does that make sense? Looking in the chats, does that make sense to everybody? So the call to action really is, if you haven't done so already, set a net zero target. Join the race to zero. You can do this with Planet Mark. We're one of the official partners of the UN Race to Zero campaign. So you can go onto our website and we have a pledge wall that you can find through the menu. And that allows you to pledge your net zero target publicly transparently, that then makes you an official part of the Race to Zero, and you get all the assets as part of that, and you join that movement. On the screen, you can see the criteria. So you pledge today, your CEO has to be in on it, and you need to commit to reducing your emissions 50% by 2030. Then within 12 months of joining, you've got to come up with a plan on how you're going to do that. So today you pledge, within 12 months, you need to have a plan on what you're doing to start progressing towards that target. Third, you must proceed. You have to take immediate action. You can't just kick the can down the road a couple of years. You have to demonstrate that you've made progress. Fourth, publish. Each year, you have to publish transparently and publicly your progress against your target so that people can see where you're at and what you're doing. And then fifth and finally, persuade. And that's that you need to align your external policy and lobbying activities if you're engaging with trade associations and things like that. Basically, what this is saying is you can't, say lovely things about net zero over here, and then behind closed doors be lobbying for things that go directly against that target and that ambition. That's what the persuade step is all about. So you've got to set, so this is you getting going on setting your target. But one of the big shifts that we saw at COP this year, certainly in conversations, maybe not so much in the summit's outcomes, is that people are starting to understand how we need to move from beyond targets like this. This is great. Setting a target is a good first step. You can't progress towards something you haven't set a target for. However, we need to move from targets to action. And we started seeing that some at COP. So, an example of a target being announced by nations or a bloc, the EU announced a new target around achieving 40% decrease in emissions by 2030 in some sectors that had been missed from its plans before: buildings, waste, agriculture, road transport, and small industries. So that's great because those sectors represent, I think, up to 60% of the EU's carbon footprint. And that's fantastic. It's a really good target, but it is a target, not an announcement of an action. What we started seeing at COP is more countries and organizations coming out with tangible commitments in terms of actions. And this is really what we want to see coming over the next year in the build up to COP28. So, for example, France announced some really cool things in the build up to and at COP. France are taking action on things like all new buildings in France must have either solar panels or a green roof. That's an action. That's not setting a target around how we're going to achieve more solar energy by 2030. That is, here's how we're going to do that. We're going to make sure there's solar panels or a green roof on every building that we build now. They had made a similar commitment with car parks. Any car park with more than 80 spaces must be covered with solar panels. We saw India are covering their canals with solar panels because it helps prevent the water loss to water evaporating, and it generates them solar energy. France also announced that fresh fruits and vegetables weighing less than 1.5 kilograms cannot be packaged in plastic anymore. So these are really good examples of the difference between a target and an action for what you're doing. Now, to give you some company level examples, we've got some lovely photos here from a few Planet Mark members. GLP are a big sort of developer of sort of logistics parks and commercial real estate. And they are actually, with Planet Mark, we supported them on the first net zero building via the sort of UK Green Building Council framework for net zero. And this was around how they could demonstrate reductions in emissions throughout the entire construction project, from the design to the materials, to the processes used, to the supply chain and logistics, and the operational emissions at the end of it, both embodied and operational, the whole life carbon. And there are quite a number of large construction firms that are really moving fast in this area, like GLP and Prologis, Mount Anvil, a whole range of others. And with Planet Mark, we're now one of about 20 organizations who are helping define the next generation of the UK net zero carbon buildings standard. So watch this space, because there's going to be more. If you're in construction, look that up, and also look up Part Z. Part Z, literally on Friday, has its second reading in Parliament. It's a bill which will make whole life carbon emission assessments mandatory for new construction projects. So worth looking that up. That's in the pipeline. It's a big industry proposed bill that's coming through that will make construction projects whole life carbon mandatory as part of building regulations. We've also seen Hillbrush, they're a brush manufacturer. And that's, you can see Philip there, they've been featured in a Lloyd's campaign. And that's because they've been doing a huge amount with their factory and their facilities as a manufacturer, where they really have built their factory from the ground up with sustainable principles in mind for energy efficiency, for energy generation. And Philip shared with me when we sort of hung out recently that investing in on-site renewables in particular, putting solar panels on the roof of their factory, the return on investment has gone bananas. It went from being sort of 9 to 10 years when they were first starting this journey about 7 or 8 years ago, 9 to 10 year payback period. It's now a 1 to 2 year payback period. So he said it's gone from being already a pretty good investment to almost being a business model in its own right. So, they're making progress on that. Restore, doing a huge amount around decarbonizing their fleet, switching out to electric vehicles and coming up with a longer term plan on how they're going to do that, over what period of time will they make that investment and do those trade outs. Planning ahead is really important, particularly when you get into those bigger investments, which take more thought. You can't just, switch out your vehicles overnight. You're going to want to come up with a plan over what period of time you're going to do that and what impact do you know that that's going to have on reducing your emissions, so you can plan that net zero journey for yourself. And then finally, I wanted to highlight Hillier Garden Centres in retail, and they've, this is the importance of collaboration. One of our sort of core values is all about collaboration. And it's been wonderful seeing Hillier collaborate with Clark Controls, with Bramble Crest, and with the Open Energy Market, where they've installed, they've stripped out all of their gas-fired heating and replaced with reverse cycle air conditioning units. They've put insulation throughout the roof and the entire structure. They've purchased 100% of their energy is through REGO certified renewables, and Bramble Crest are their furniture supplier, who are also Planet Mark certified. And this is where you start to see, because of Scope 3 emissions, organizations want to work with other organizations who are on their journey with net zero, measuring their emissions, reducing their emissions, because this all helps you to reduce your own Scope 3 emissions. So there's a huge values being part of a network of organizations who are committed down this path, particularly if you can get that data in the same format that you're used to working with it in. So it's been really wonderful seeing that collaboration with some of our Planet Mark members there. So lots of stuff there. So that's moving from targets to action, right? So if you haven't set a net zero target, please set a target. If you have, okay, what are your actions? What's your plan? What are your short-term, medium-term, and long-term plans towards reducing? A lot of these things can bring you business benefits through cost savings, through wider opportunities to tap into the supply chains of public procurement and larger organizations who are hungry to find suppliers who align with these things. So that was one of the major shifts in the conversations, at least at COP. What people were saying, there has been a shift in people talking about more action, action, action. We saw the same themes of workshops being done again and again and again and again and again. And that was actually a good thing, because it was people going, no, the most important question is, how do we move to net zero action, net zero action, net zero action? So it was good to see in the fringes of COP. We just now need to see a lot more of that inside the blue zone with the negotiations coming into UAE next year. And with that, I think we're going to open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to pass to Amelie and bring Roger back up so that we can answer some of your questions.
Yeah, great, Andrew. Whilst you've been speaking, there's been a flurry of activities, both in the chat, but we're looking at the Q&A list. And indeed, guys, you've been, it's great. We've got lots and lots of questions to get through. We're going to go by, the ones that have been voted for the most. So right up the top, we have a question from Anna. When and how do you think disclosure and reduction plans will be made mandatory? So getting on that ability to plan ahead.
So certainly for the UK, for large organizations, for listed companies and financial institutions, it is now mandatory by the end of next year that they need to have that in place. So by the end of 2023, that's what's happening there. Initially, that's then going to get passed on indirectly to other organizations. Because if you're Tesco's and say anywhere between, I'm making this up, but anywhere between 80% and 99% of your carbon footprint will be in your scope 3 value chain emissions. If Tesco need to achieve a 90% reduction overall for their whole carbon footprint, they can't do that unless their suppliers, on average, achieve a 90% reduction, right? So that's why it cascades through in a really different way. And so it's already becoming mandatory for larger organizations. And I think we're going to see how that gets passed on in a way that we're just not used to in other forms of legislation, being passed on by the larger corporations to their supply chain. So I think within a relatively short space of time, we're going to see it become mandatory for a lot more organizations of different sizes. But Roger, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right, Andrew, because, you know, as you say, those transition plans, it's going to be a requirement for listed companies. So a requirement from the FCA. In terms of, though, of it becoming mandatory on a broader basis, or for example, ISSB standards becoming mandatory, I think we're still some way ahead of that, although I think ultimately that is the destination we're heading for. There was some discussion in the audit reform, which is being currently considered by the UK government, which hasn't yet been implemented, however, of making the audit process covering sustainability related disclosures. But currently, it was decided not to proceed with that, and to just stick to audit of, you know, the kind of core financial data which is currently audited. But I think you're right, Andrew, that there is, you know, this is a kind of a major step change to actually get listed companies or companies at the top of supply chains to actually have a reason to make those kind of demands regarding disclosure of their suppliers. That is going to permeate through the supply chain, and provides a real kind of commercial incentive for companies to look at this, which so up to now, they haven't, perhaps the kind of direct commercial incentive hasn't been there for many.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's coming. I mean, my personal number one policy thing that I would love to see would be scope 1 emission measurement and reporting, which scope 1 emissions is essentially the fuel that you burn. For most organizations, it's your gas, heating, and your vehicles, if you own any. Right, that's fuel that you burn directly. If we made it so that all organizations were reporting that through their invoices up, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions just become analytics and data sharing. It simplifies things considerably. So I think in the medium to long term, we're going to see that kind of a requirement come in from governments, because it simplifies the entire process. So we don't have to do any complex models or complex estimates anymore if we have that raw scope 1 data being fed all the way up through supply chains. So that's one of the things that Planet Mark is certainly pushing for and are advocating for. And I think when sort of governments sort of wake up to the fact that that's not too much of an ask upon businesses to do it, if you put the systems in place, but if they give a long enough piece of notice where they say, you know, by 2025 or by 2027, whatever it might be, this will come into effect, it gives businesses time to think about it, prepare, get themselves ready, so that we're not springing things on people last minute. We really need that long-term view from government to give really clear milestones for businesses to understand how these things are going to come in and affect them over a longer period of time.
Yes, and in fact, just to add to that, Andrew, you know, we recently wrote to Grant Shapps, who's the new business secretary. One of our key asks was that small business, you know, just needs a simple framework whereby it can report on its sort of carbon profit and loss account, or carbon balance sheet, as it were. You know, that should be absolutely possible. And as you say, there is impetus coming through the supply chain for smaller companies to do that. But what we've got to do is get to the point where you know, the publication of your financial statements each year incorporates carbon accounting. And that then opens the door to all sorts of things. I mean, so for example, we've advocated that if you can demonstrate you're a net zero company, you should be rewarded through a lower rate of corporation tax. But in order for that kind of policy to be feasible, you have to have the kind of the accounting framework in place. You have to have the plumbing in place, essentially, within our business system, and that's starting to happen, but still some way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've probably got time for maybe one more question. Where are we going, Emily?
But when do you think, if at all, the UK will introduce a carbon tax to force businesses to measure and reduce their emissions?
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't seem on the table at the moment, I have to say. It's one of these things that almost every economist you speak to will tell you that one of the absolute key things you need to do in order to really make progress towards decarbonising the economy is to have proper carbon taxation covering a wide range of outputs of the economy at an appropriate carbon price. But you know, we've seen the problems that the current government has got into around taxation recently, and all the concerns about the fiscal black hole and so on. And so it doesn't appear to be something which is on the horizon at the current time, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I sort of share that reflection. There are other things around. So the IOD, as Roger has alluded to, have talked around tax incentives that could be put in place around net zero. We've also seen some other sort of business groups like the British Interactive Media Association have proposed that there should be an environmental tax credit, similar to an R&D tax credit, but one that becomes an umbrella incentive for investment into environmentally aligned sort of CapEx projects like energy efficiency measures, on-site renewable generation, all of those sorts of things, which we would be very supportive of as well, to sort of incentivize and make it easier for businesses, particularly smaller and medium-sized businesses, to make those investments. So I think we probably are about the point we need to wrap up. We'll have a look through questions, and if we can answer any more, we'll try and make sure that we answer as many as we can in the 1-2 page follow-up document that we're going to send around in the next couple of days. So very sorry if we didn't get to your question, but there are a lot of questions and a lot of you. No, thank you very much from me. I'm going to hand across to Amelie now to do our roundup from the session today.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we have the deck coming back up for you guys.
Yes, we do. There we go.
Great. So, indeed, thank you so much, Andrew and Roger, for answering questions. We will indeed, we think that definitely there's the world is demanding climate leadership here, and there's a real role here for the business community to really step up, as you know. And there are indeed things that you can do straight away off the back of this call if you want to. Do set up a call with one of our experts. We're happy to talk you through your net zero journey. Use the email address here on the screen, and you can benefit from that just using a code COP27. We also have upcoming net zero training opportunities for you, your team. We have our net zero carbon essentials coming up. Again, we'd like to extend a discount. Please come and join us. And then we have also freely available carbon reduction toolkits on our website. Come and have a look and download anything that could be helpful for you. So again, to re-emphasize, chances are, many of you are somewhere in a supply chain, up or down the value chain. Get ready now so that you're well prepared for the day that you will receive that sort of Tesco style email asking for data. So yeah, we're here to support. Thank you so much for having stayed with us this afternoon. We think that absolutely collaboration here is key, and business community, we probably have an opportunity to take action where possibly political leaders are lagging behind. So thanks so much, guys. Please put your comments, thoughts in the session. Finally, we also have a quick poll before I forget. We'd love to find out if there's anything on this poll that you would love to attend. Vote for any sort of upcoming training. We'd love to put these on for you. Give us your thoughts here as to what you would find most useful to you. And that's really the last ask before we let you go. Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. I can see your responses are coming back in. Lots of interest there with regards to the ISO net zero guidelines, net zero carbon essentials, supply chain engagement, also excellent. Thank you, guys. We will, on that note, say goodbye and good luck to you all. And we are here, and come talk to us at any point. Thank you, everybody, so much. And thank you to Roger, and thank you to Andrew for a brilliant summary.